The G20 has been a grand success, viewer. There's no chest-thumping nationalism in agreeing that under India's presidency, the G20 has made perhaps its most monumental expansion by admitting the African Union, forging consensus from a world at war, and truly coming into its own as a country that isn't just a stabilizing force, but a power for uncompromising good in the world. This reliable oasis that can always be depended on for sober, decisive, independent leadership that appeals to all sides. Now, the amazing victory that each one of us should be proud of was the main course of the G20 summit in Delhi. But there has been a very bitter side dish that was also served. A truly tragic, bitter and wholly expected spectacle of hubris and entitlement. It started way before the G20 summit, but it has culminated, in my view, in two words uttered so effortlessly by Congress leader Priyanka Gandhi today in a pole-bound rally in Rajasthan. Listen first to what she said.
आज सुबह तो मैंने देखा कि इनके G20 जब हो रहा था तो बारिश आई और सारा जितना भी वो जहां पे वो G20 की मीटिंग रख रहे हैं उसमें सारा पानी फैल गया है। मेरे मन में एक बात आई कि शायद जो हमारे देशवासी डर के मारे कह नहीं पा रहे हैं, भगवान ने कह दिया कि अपना अहंकार कम करो, अपना अहंकार कम करो। इस देश ने तुम्हें बनाया है, इस देश ने नेता बनाया है, इस देश को आगे रखो।
Inke G20. Inke G20, their G20, not the countries, not our collective victory as a nation, but their G20. As I always say, we're a scrappy, vibrant, noisy democracy where things like Inke G20 will understandably fly, especially in an election season that's defined by its historic levels of no-holds-barred acrimony. But the bitterness enshrined in those two words, Inke G20, and with much else that has happened over the last few days, is not only self-revealing, but in my view, an indication of how electoral compulsions have poisoned the ability to even be proud of something the country, not a party, has achieved. It's one thing to ask questions and demand accountability, something I firmly believe should never stop. But this entitled sense of hostility is not only jarring and misplaced, it has been the sideshow throughout India's G20 presidency. When India became the G20 president nation last year, the opposition made it a point to emphasize that it was rotational, as if that wasn't known. When President Putin pulled out earlier this month, sections of the opposition laughed, wondering how Modi's good friend, Achha Dost, had abandoned him for the Delhi G20 summit. When Xi Jinping pulled out, sections called it a slap on the face of Modi's leadership, when the truth, as we've told you here, is probably just the opposite. When the G20 leaders arrived in Delhi for the summit, a whole lineup of opposition leaders poured scorn on the dance swagat that was organized for them at the Palam Air Base in Delhi. When day two of the G20 began, a lineup of opposition leaders, with the notable exception of Shehzad Aroor, rather than cheer India's achievements at the G20, were busy posting pictures of flooded areas of the Bharat Mandapam, which I believe is totally appropriate to highlight. But if that's your big takeaway from the G20's day one, in the absence of all else, then clearly your frustration is showing. When the final Sherpa meeting on the G20 summit's eve reported that no consensus had been reached, a whole section started dancing in glee, convinced that the G20 would be a stalemate or even a failure. When a full consensus Delhi declaration was announced a day later, this same frustrated section immediately pounced on how Russia wasn't mentioned by its name, and it was a watered-down consensus, spectacularly oblivious to the fact that this is precisely what consensus is when you're the leader of a grouping that involves countries literally on two ends of the war you're talking about: Russia, the United States, China, and others. The Ukraine consensus must have been especially painful for this section, given that former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh had praised the Modi government's policy on Ukraine in a newspaper interview just before the G20 Delhi summit. So the claws were obviously out. Sadly for them, consensus happened. With the G20 Delhi summit a runaway success by all accounts and across all experts, the frustrated brigade saw some hope in President Biden's comment in Vietnam that he, like always, had spoken to Prime Minister Modi about free press and human rights, which is important, but it isn't the first time. And also, this section had nothing to say about the huge things Modi and Biden have agreed to in their bilateral, most notably the massive India, Middle East, Europe infrastructure corridor. At the President's gala dinner for the G20 leaders, most India alliance chief ministers stayed away. Among those who didn't, like Mamata Banerjee, MK Stalin, Sukhwinder Singh Sukhu, Nitish Kumar, Hemant Soren, some had to come in for attacks from their very own, like Mamata Banerjee. So, viewer, it all comes down to two words: inke G20. I don't think the Congress or the opposition realizes the honesty in those two words, because that's how bad, polarized and vitiated things have become. When a national victory, not the BJP or NDA, needs to be pushed away, assaulted repeatedly because elections are near and it doesn't suit your agenda. It's something to think about.